good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are. It's nice to see so many friends, former students, and even members of the GSB class of 1994, which I like to say is the single greatest class our school ever graduated. Of course, but that's conscious bias right there. I see Carl nodding, so that's a good thing. I'm Rob, and I'm going to walk everyone through a brief, summary of my book, The Systems Leader. Thank you for your interest. And then I'll go for about 35 minutes giving some of the stuff that we learned. This is based on a course that I've taught for the last 8 years at the GSB called Systems Leadership, which I co-taught with my friend and colleague and former boss, Jeff Immelt. And then we'll do Q&A in the last 25 minutes. Let's get started. Who's me? I'm Rob. I'm the short bald guy on the other side of the camera. 2 full-time jobs and no life. As was talked about earlier, I'm a full-time member of the faculty here at the GSB. I'm also a slimy scum venture capitalist, and those of you from the industry know that that's an entirely redundant expression. Before this, I had a variety of operating roles. Worked at Intel when I graduated from the GSB in 94. I ran a division of GE, was a several-time entrepreneur, started a company that made the world's first digital picture frames. That company got bought by Kodak. Worked for a company that made image sensors and image processors. That company got bought by Sony. Two-time author. We're going to talk today about The Systems Leader. My first book was The Brains and Brawn Company, about blending digital and physical. That was a book that was based on a course that I taught called The Industrialist Dilemma. If you're having trouble sleeping, that's the book for you. It'll put you right to sleep. Did my undergraduate work across the Bay at the University of California, Berkeley. Did my graduate work here at the GSB. And once upon a time, I used to have hair. By the way, this picture's got nothing to do with anything that I'm going to talk about in the next 40 minutes, but I put it up whenever I can just to kind of remember the good old days. Um, I've taught 9 different courses, as we talked about earlier. Some of them are listed here. I've written a number of cases. You can see them, some of them across the logos across the bottom of the screen. The idea behind this is hopefully that we've had the blessing and good fortune of studying companies from all over the world that have helped inform some of our learnings and best practices. With that, I'm going to get going here. Some of you may have heard of that guy, the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett, and he was very fond of saying, it's only when the tide goes out that we see who's been swimming without a bathing suit. But it kind of feels like with today's business leaders that the tide is out and it's staying out. And when Buffett was talking about that, saying he was talking about economic cycles, he was talking about what happens when times are good. It seems like everything is fine, but when recession hits and the economy slows down, the tide goes out, and you really have to focus on things like how do you run your business well in unit economics. The challenge we feel is that in the last 25 years, we seem to be in a world of constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change. We wake up every morning and we turn on our computer and it's like, oh my God, what happened last night? And it seems that no matter what we do, we're being like buffeted by all of these crazy things that are happening in a variety of vectors. Extreme disruptions based upon climate change, based upon changing societal norms, economic instability, technological upheavals, geopolitical conflict, going back to the global financial crisis and everything that started for us. And then even changing societal norms. If any of you are managing multiple generations from Gen Xers to millennials to Gen Zs, like how do we navigate people who've had very, very different lived experiences? And it's really what we found with a lot of the leaders that we were studying. They felt like that no matter what they do, they were going to get it wrong. And they were really being pulled apart by these ideas that I call cross pressures that I'm going to describe in a moment. But the idea of the cross pressure is that leaders feel like they're being pulled in 180-degree different directions in what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be approaching situations. And this they feel like is going to make or break their companies. If they get it wrong, they're going to be canceled or they're going to be fired and lose their jobs. And there's this constant sense of I don't know what to do given everything that's being thrown at leaders today. Now, one of the questions that I get asked is, okay, what doesn't work in a world of constant crisis? And I like to refer to these things as unserious behaviors in a serious world. So what isn't compelling? So let me give you 3 specific examples of this. And these examples, by the way, are not to be political in any way. I'm actually just trying to highlight behaviors that we look at. We kind of cock our head and go, that doesn't seem to make much sense. Do you all remember a couple of years ago when Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk were going to fight in a cage match? I mean, this thing was all over the news, right? On every single online, television, print news organization all over the world. And you had two of the greatest business leaders in the world who were talking about beating each other up in a cage match. And everybody I talked to had two reactions to this. Number one, I'm going to watch it. And number two, this is wrong. Like, this isn't something we should see our leaders doing. In the center, you see Congresswoman AOC, very, very well known Congresswoman from New York, one of the leaders in the Democratic Party. At one point, she was on holiday and she ended up sending out a tweet that said, if Republicans are so sexually frustrated that they can't sleep with me, they shouldn't take it out on my personal life. And I remember seeing that tweet and I remember looking at it kind of going, huh, I couldn't imagine Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi or Golda Meir sending out a tweet like that. But yet this is actually pretty common in what we might see in today's political environment. On the right side of the screen, we see Sam Bankman-Fried, obviously something that's relevant to all of us at Stanford, given that he grew up on the Stanford campus, his parents being faculty members here at Stanford. And he used to go to meetings dressed like a slob. He would raise money while playing video games with the world's greatest venture funds. You know, we see this behaviors and we kind of know something's off about it. You know, it's divisive, it's destructive, and it's limiting. And these behaviors, which seem very prominent, I kind of put them into six categories, what I call these unserious behaviors and these patterns to avoid. Those examples are replacing decorum with outrageousness. Now, we know why people do it. They get clicks, you know, they get likes, and they get talked about all the time in the media. We see people focusing on trivial goals. Do you remember NFTs? Like, that was kind of a hot thing for about 3 years, where you'd get basically 6 million JPEGs that were absolutely identical, and one of them was worth $8 million, and the other 7,999,999 were absolutely worthless, even though they were all the same. Let's face it, this was an attempt to try to bilk the masses, to try to get people to try to assign value to something that shouldn't have had value assigned to it. Ignoring changes we don't like. We see leaders who will not focus on taking the time to integrate, AI into their everyday workflows, or who don't realize that the younger generation really is getting a lot of their news and information from TikTok that shapes their worldview. Acting with disdain for customers. One of my favorite examples of this, believe it or not, is Tim Cook. For those of you in the United States, and if you're familiar with iMessage, you know about in iMessage blue bubbles and green bubbles? That's right. Blue bubbles are people who use iMessage and iOS, and green bubbles are like lowly people who use Android. Tim Cook was asked, how come Apple doesn't support RCS, which is a protocol, a communications protocol that would allow rich communication between Apple devices and Android devices? And Cook looked at the journalist and said, well, our customers aren't asking for it. Buy your mom an iPhone. Now, if you think about that, he's basically saying he doesn't want to have a good experience for people who have non-Apple products. And he said his customers aren't asking for it. Well, I got to tell you, I'm an Apple customer. I'm doing this presentation right now on my MacBook Pro. And I bet over the last 12, 13 years, I bet I've spent $100,000 on Apple products for my family, our three kids, my wife, me. I use an iPad. They're all iPhones. I happen to like my Google Pixel phone. This is the one Android device that I have. And of the $100,000 that I've spent on Apple products, I bet 50,000 of that are on cables. All the cables, when they change the connectors at the end and they break all the time. And Cook's message was, no matter how much money I have spent on Apple, I'm really not one of his customers, even though I wanted to have a better experience in a group message, when my family is trading video and audio and still images. And Apple used to downsample the quality of those media. And the only reason Apple started to support RCS is because they were forced to by the EU government, who basically said, you have to do this. It was disdain for their customers by saying basically someone like me wasn't his customer. Indulging in self-righteousness. Some of you may remember CRV, the very well-known and very successful venture capital firm here in Silicon Valley. In 2016, before the presidential election, they put up a website that said F star 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 Trump. And what they said was, we don't believe in anything that Trump says. We don't believe in his policy towards immigration. And basically, if you're a bigot and you support Trump, you shouldn't apply for money from us. Well, okay. they just called half the country bigots in 2016 before the election, and they could have written a very thoughtful piece about the importance of immigration, the history that has played in our country, excuse me, the benefits we have, brought by bringing people from all over the world into the United States for 250 years. But that wouldn't have gotten them the clicks that they got for the self-righteousness of putting up F star 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 Trump. Like most organizations generally don't put stuff like up that out into the world. And finally, failing to show spine when necessary. We saw this around the world in some of the volatile times that we've dealt with politically, where leaders, for example, on campuses around the world could have stood up and said, in these volatile times, everybody in our community is welcome. We will debate hard issues with respect and intelligence, but everybody in our community, no matter who they are, is a part of who we are. You know, President Levin's actually done a pretty good job of that since John took over at Stanford, but we saw how that was missing in the early days, for example, of the challenges in the last 2 years in the Middle East. And we see these patterns to avoid, and they're maybe helpful in the short run to be able to do these things, but I argue they are counterproductive in the long run. The question is, what is compelling for leadership, both in business and otherwise, in today's world? Now, systems leadership is a new framework that Jeff and I have been developing over really almost over the last decade, where we hope that we're going to give people the tools to find clarity in their chaos. And so what I want to do right now is share a little bit about what we mean by systems leadership, and then talk about some best practices of leaders that we've had the good fortune of studying over the years. By the way, I see in the text that in the chat that Ethan said, "Do I see the Musk Trump falling out as an apex of these psychopathic behaviors I'm describing?" That's a good way to describe it. I just would kind of say all of the back and forth we saw between Trump and Musk, kind of like, is that really what we want in our leadership? And that's not a political statement. I'm trying to kind of look more of, are these the leaders that we want to follow? And I want to try to show a slightly different model of what we think that leaders can be doing. Now, what is systems leadership? Systems leadership really combines two things: the ability for certain individuals, all of us, to master dualities, certain things that maybe might have been kept separate inside of an organization, but that we need to internalize for ourselves and be able to live kind of in the and as opposed to the or. And it's also the ability to see interactions between parts of a company, between functions inside of an organization and its broader ecosystem. In a world where everything is connected, it's important that people are able to have an understanding of how systems interact with each other. Now, I talked about cross pressures earlier, these 5 cross pressures that I highlight here, where people feel like they're being pulled in opposite directions. The 5 cross pressures that are not meant to be the only cross pressures that leaders are challenged by, but the 5 we saw most prevalent are the following. The first is priorities. How do you succeed at both execution and innovation at the same time? Secondly, people. How do we lead with both strength and empathy? Third, how do we think about sphere of influence, both internal and external? Fourth, global. Geography. How do we deal with both global and local? And finally, purpose. How do we be ambitious as individuals, but also how do we behave as statesmen or stateswomen or stewards of our organization? And so what I want to do now is talk about the things that systems leaders do, and then we'll go through those examples of what we saw as leaders who helped navigate through these cross pressures. We really saw systems leaders and the over 100 men and women that we studied over the course really kind of do these 4 things: operate at intersections, manage context, think like a product manager, and then run towards disruption when disruption was happening to their company or their industry. Now, what do I mean by being, managing, living in that duality? So the table that you see up on the screen there, this column, the first one, the disruptive leader, this is kind of what we think about with Silicon Valley. People think horizontal in how they think about their business and platforms. They think about software. They think about winner take all. They look at workers as flexible and gig, and government libertarian, leave us alone. Again, you might see this throughout most companies we would see in Silicon Valley. The middle column, the incumbent leader, this is often what we see in more established companies. It's very vertically focused, know your domain. It's hardware focused. You think about continuous improvement on your products. When I was at GE, if I gave my customers a 6 to 7% cost improvement every year, they never left me. Government, you engage with them often towards regulatory capture, things that we might teach in classes, B delta E and strategy beyond markets. If you remember those classes, that's how, these types of organizations, think when they interact with government. Systems leaders actually combine the best of both of those. They understand both horizontal and vertical. They understand software and hardware. They think about portfolio career when they think about the future of work. The future of work is not just about trying to keep somebody in your company forever or a gig employee. This idea of a portfolio career, people might be doing multiple things at the same time. I have a portfolio career. I'm a member of the GSB faculty. I'm a consultant. I also, I teach, I invest. I do multiple different things. If you're managing Gen Z, I got to tell you, they all have a side hustle. Everybody who works for you is doing something on the side. My question for the companies that I work for is, why don't you design the ability for them to do that inside of the company, because they're going to do it anyway? It could benefit your employees, but it could also benefit your organization. And finally, you have to have a balanced view towards government. We might like government, we might not like government. Government fundamentally, though, is your new business partner, whether you like it or not. 20th century geopolitical conflict, I would argue, was shaped by political ideology. Originally, it was fascism versus Western democracy, and then communism versus Western democracy. 21st century geopolitical conflict is being shaped by economic ideology. Right? At the extremes and at the poles, you've got dictatorial capitalism, uncontrolled capitalism, and democratic socialism. And the question for leaders is, they're going to be navigating between all of these poles and everything in between, because in a world of communication and collaboration tools, you're going to have suppliers and customers all over the world, whether you're with a large organization or whether you're even running a smaller startup. And people need to think like systems leaders to deal with these dualities. Now, the other three things that we see systems leaders do as they manage these cross pressures is they manage context. One of the things that we used to talk about in the class is that truth equals facts plus context. Facts are facts, but how we make sense of the craziness is the context that we understand things. And leaders need to be great communicators to make sure that they can help their suppliers, their employees, their customers make sense of craziness that goes on all around them. All the leaders that I'm about to walk you through right now were unbelievable communicators at helping people manage context. The third thing we saw great leaders do was to think like a product manager. Now, maybe that's conscious bias. My career was in product. And I would argue that product managers in most organizations, like, you're responsible for everything and you own nothing. And the trick is, how do you get your organization to move down a path that you want it to go down? You need to understand what the customers want. You need to know what customer needs are. You need to know how your product and service gets built. And then finally, you need to know your go-to-market momentum. And the great leaders that I'm about to walk you through act and behave like product managers when dealing with problems. And lastly, we saw all of these great leaders run into disruption. Now, in a world when you're going through disruption, we sometimes want to hold on to what we have right now and maybe just wait for the storm to pass. But when you're dealing with disruption at a moment in time, you can't actually kind of just hunker down. I used to work for Andy Grove, and he used to talk about that you can't save your way out of a recession. You need to invest your way out of a recession. And when you're dealing with, technological disruption or societal disruption, you actually have to run straight towards the disruption. And the reason is, I don't know what's on the other side of the disruption, but I know it's not what came before us. Or said differently, what's out the front windshield of our car, that is not what's in the rearview mirror. And great leaders have to run straight towards the disruption, even when it's very uncomfortable. All right, let me give some examples of the leaders we studied, and then I want to make sure I get some time to get to more of the Q&A. All right, so priorities, execution, and innovation. One of the great leaders we studied on this was a woman by the name of Julie Sweet, who runs Accenture. You've got a company, $65 billion in revenue, almost 800,000 employees. They are hugely invested in trying to be an innovation-led company. 10 years ago, they were a back-end IT software shop. Then they started to move up the stack. They invested in cybersecurity and the cloud and even digital advertising. And now they're at the forefront of AI. I run into Accenture in every part of the world, every continent that I do business on. It's amazing to see what their leaders are doing, trying to learn new things to help their clients. At the same time, Julie holds her team accountable and says, okay, you need to hit your quarterly numbers, but we as a company will invest $1 billion training you and making sure you know what's going on with technology so that you can actually help our clients do better. And so it's really an interesting thing where she makes sure all of her leaders, they take the time to make sure they deliver their numbers, but also that they invest in themselves, and she'll make the resources available so they can invest themselves. But the leaders need to do it if they're actually going to stay in the organization. And she will actually cycle people out who don't invest in keeping their skills current and working on innovation as well. It's really one of these interesting things where she will make sure that throughout the organization are doing both of the execution as well as the innovation. Another company we studied is a small organization in Kuwait called Bubian Bank. Very, very interesting bank. In 2013 and 2014, this was a small Sharia compliant bank that was really struggling. And three leaders, led by Adil Al Majid, went into the company to take it over because the bank was going to go under. And they looked at the Kuwaiti population and they said, okay, 15% of the population of Kuwait will only bank at an Islamic Sharia compliant bank. 15% of the Kuwaiti population will never bank at a Sharia compliant bank. And 70% of the Kuwaiti population didn't care. They just wanted a good bank. So what they realized they could do, that they had this false choice. So they started investing heavily in digital. They became really, really popular with the young people. They pioneered cardless withdrawals to get cash out of ATMs. They simultaneously invested in a lot of physical branches throughout Kuwait, and they quickly realized they could both attract new customers, and particularly the youth, and retain their existing customers while still being true to their Islamic heritage. And what they found was that they moved within 6 years from being the eighth largest bank in Kuwait to the third largest bank. They spread throughout the GCC and MENA region and are now actually having success throughout Greater Europe. They had this false choice between execution and innovation. They realized they could do both. The second cross pressure, actually, I will skip this slide on AI just because of time, but I'll get to it later. The second cross pressure to talk about is people. How do we lead with both strength and empathy? One of the great leaders we studied was a woman named Kathy Mazzarella. Kathy runs a company called Graybar. Graybar is the old Western Electric. It's about $11 billion in revenue, 10,000 employees. By the way, all employee owned. Kathy was described by somebody as an iron fist in a velvet glove. When Kathy walks into the room, we all sit up a little bit straighter. This is a strong leader who we actually we want to make sure that we're, bringing our best self when we're in her presence. But she's also very human. She's one of the kindest people I've ever met. When she goes into a meeting, she not only wants to see the humanity of the person on the other side of the table, but she also shows her humanity. If she's got a non-performer or somebody who's not delivering what needs to be done, the question that she's asking herself is, do I have a skill set mismatch? Or is there something going on in this person's life that might be getting in the way of their ability to deliver? And it's interesting, when she took over our class, one of the things that she looked at our students and said is, leadership's about everybody but you. Right? She really had this kind of mindset of how did she get her team and her company to where it needs to go. She's been with this organization 40 years, started at the very bottom, and has now been running the company for the last 10. Really, really has this both strength, this is a strong leader, but also very, very kind. Another leader we studied that showed this as well is Revathi, who's the CEO of Flex, one of the world's largest contract manufacturing companies. It's really interesting. They invest very, very heavily, not only in technological innovation in factories. You see the picture in the middle of the screen. Most of Flex's factories are actually quite clean because they're not as dirty like they used to be. But they also invest a lot in cultural training. One of the things that Revathi told me was that she had to invest heavily to make sure her factories in different parts of the world know how to work together. So that, for example, the culture of the factory in Mexico knows how to work with the culture of the factory in Poland, because together they will end up giving the final product to their customer base. So this notion of strength and empathy, she's like, we have to deliver in a very, very competitive market of contract manufacturing, but we've also got to be sure the soft skills, our people know how to do this both internally and with our customers for them to be effective. There's a line at the bottom of the slide that says, learning is the new pension. That was a line that was created by a woman named Heather McGowan. She's a sociologist. And what's really interesting is, given the speed of technological change, given how fast things are going, education can't keep up. K through 12 can't keep up with how fast things are going. Higher education can't keep up. I got to tell you, 100% of our students at GSB and at Stanford are using LLMs to basically write all their papers and to do their problem sets. We have to be thinking differently about how we teach, and we're all inside of Stanford trying to figure this out. Companies are going to need to invest in their employees to make sure that they have the skill to be competitive in today's world. And Flex and what Revathi, they really understand this. They know that education is something they just can't depend on the education system to give the employee base that they need to be competitive in today's world. Companies are going to have to do this as well. All right, the third cross pressure people deal with, sphere of influence, internal and external. In the old world, you could have a CEO who was externally focused and a COO who was internally focused. And maybe we like doing one of those things, more than the other. But in today's world, where things are going on, what happens outside impacts inside, and what happens inside impacts outside, we need to be able to do both. What a sales organization might sell could have a huge impact in the configuration of products that could impact a factory or customer service. Or if I'm in finance, I'm looking at a set of numbers. I can't make sense of those numbers if I don't know what's happening outside of the building and what might be driving whether sales or costs are going up or down. One of the leaders we studied is a gentleman named Charlie Scharf, the CEO of Wells Fargo. Charlie took over the bank after it had committed massive fraud, right? They opened up all of these accounts against customers' will. The government came in and basically put an asset cap on them. And I got to tell you, Charlie was telling me the story. Boy, the government, they were pissed. The regulators were really angry. I mean, they were made to look like fools. And let's face it, they didn't commit the fraud. People inside of Wells Fargo did. Charlie said that when he went into the organization, people inside of Wells Fargo were pretty pissed, right? The people in the middle managers and down below were like, how could leaders have done something so horrible to destroy our brand? But he also noticed the toxicity in the culture. He noticed that a lot of people inside of the company didn't respect the regulators. So he had to spend a lot of time working externally with Washington, trying to say, look, we're going to earn back your trust. We screwed up and we're going to fix this. And he had to spend a lot of time internally saying, no, no, the regulators, they're there for a reason. And we've got to make sure we don't have disdain for them. We've got to respect the communities in which we do business. And so he really had to balance that internal and external. He couldn't just do one or the other. He had to do both. You might have read a couple of weeks ago, the asset cap got lifted off of Wells Fargo Bank. It took him 6 years after he took over the bank to try to get everything fixed to make the government comfortable enough to allow them to basically grow again as a bank. Another person we studied in this whole sphere of influence, internal and external, was a gentleman named Seth Bodner, who's the president of the University of Montana system in the state of Montana. A land grant set of universities set up in the Midwest of our country. What's interesting, there's a very, very simple influence map that I've drawn on the screen there. He's got to be thinking about internal and external. Now, the mission of the University of Montana is training students to actually be contributing to the economy and the well-being of the state of Montana. Seth's got to deal with faculty. I got to tell you, we're a pain in the butt. He's got to deal with students. Sometimes they can be a pain in the butt. He's got to deal with administrators. He's got to deal with employers who are trying to hire their people, the general public. Are they being good members of the community? And if you think about your ever-changing ecosystem, all of these parts of their ecosystem, this influence map, are constantly interacting with each other. And Seth talked about how he has to navigate between understanding what's going on inside of his campuses and outside to make sure that he's got his ecosystem working properly. He's got many, many stakeholders, but one mission. And he's got to be able to see this entire system for him to be effective in his role. All right, the fourth of the cross pressures I want to talk about is geography. This notion of local and global. One of the greatest leaders we had the pleasure of hosting in class is a gentleman named Khaldoon Al-Mubarak. He's the CEO of Mubadala, which is Abu Dhabi's largest sovereign wealth fund. One of the things that Khaldoon taught me is that the DNA of Emiratis is trade. So if you go back 50 years before oil was discovered in that part of the world, the Emirates and the various Emirates that now make up the country, they were pearl traders. Basically, what they would do is they would sell pearls to basically their neighbors around the Middle East. And one of the things that allowed them to do is to realize they wanted to take a friends to all approach. That's kind of baked into the DNA of the country. And they try to avoid exclusive alliances. They have like multiple lenses for dealing with challenging situations. If you think about the UAE, this is a very, very small country that punches way above its weight class on geopolitics. Well, China is their largest customer for their oil. The United States is their security guarantor. And the UAE has got to figure out what do they need as their own, country and what's important to the Emiratis locally, but also what's happening across Europe, across the United States and Asia, and how do they make sure that they kind of have that ability to get along with everybody. Khaldun really understands this dynamic of local, what's happening in his country, but also global, and how does they play that role in interacting with all these different constituencies. We also spent time with Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, a bank based in London that does business throughout, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. One of the things that Bill taught us was that they will help their customers do business on a global basis. If Coca-Cola wants to sell their drinks and their food products in Angola, they can help find bottling and distribution, but they are sometimes caught between conflicting rules in different parts of the world. There might be laws inside of what's, in a particular country, say about people want them to have to, give up data on customers, and the laws in one country might conflict with the laws of another country, which says, no, you can't give away customer data. Bill tries to be very, very sensitive to what's happening inside of a local community, and then also try to make sure how he could help his clients navigate through these different barriers between local and global. He's very much a behind the scenes person that tries to get things done, very thoughtful to understand how does he kind of help his clients achieve what they need to achieve on a global basis when sometimes things conflict. He really does a great job of managing global complexity. All right, the last of the five cross pressures is what I call purpose. How do we deal with and balance our ambition as individuals and also statesmanship or stateswomanship or stewardship of our organizations? You see a definition on the screen of purpose. This comes from Bill Damon here at Stanford. He's one of the world's leading academics on purpose. And I love this definition because it actually captures the essence of what I think matters here in this conflict. Purpose, he says, is an active commitment to accomplish aims that are both meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. How do we think not only about it's okay for us to be ambitious and to do what we want, but how do we think about people outside of us, that duality I talked about earlier? You as business leaders and the men and women that we're teaching at Stanford, they need to lead on very nuanced issues in a world that seems to have very little time for nuance. I was asked once, about what does it mean to be a statesman or a stateswoman, or what are the attributes? And we kind of know it when we see somebody like this. I came up with six attributes of a great systems leader. The first is somebody who brings that gravitas of personality and purpose. That leader who walks into the room and we all know that we've got to bring our best selves to it. At the GSB, for me, that's Irv Grousbeck. Like when Irv walks in, we kind of like, okay, we want to be worthy of Irv. You want someone who brings an intelligence and wisdom about the seriousness of the times, understanding how hard these times are for those of us inside of companies, the men and women who work for us, our customers, etc. You want people who are dependable in volatile situations, the things that when times are tough, this is the teammate you want next to you on the team. You want people who bring a moral guidance based on principles and actions without hectoring and condescension towards others. You want people who really are inclusive and can bring in different points of view and different perspectives and make lots of people feel welcome. You want people who drive change beyond self-interest, that, it's not just about them. They're seeing the bigger picture. And then finally, we talk about how we show up, but I'm going to say it's not only about how we show up, it's when we show up on time and even if we do show up. And I think great leaders do these things and they balance that notion of ambition and stewardship. The two leaders that we studied on this, who I think really do a good job of it, one is a gentleman named Jim Fish. Jim runs Waste Management, one of the largest trash and rubbish and recycling companies inside of our country. Jim came up as the CFO inside of the organization and became the CEO, excuse me. Very ambitious, knows about hitting his numbers, but he really shows his humanity to his employees. One of the things that he talks about, he sends a monthly email out to all of his employees that he calls Fish Food for Thought. And in it, he'll write about a variety of things about the business, but he'll also write about personal issues. Jim is really interesting. He's very clear about who he is. He says to his employees, his top three priorities are his faith, his family, and then his job, in that order. And he doesn't try to proselytize. He doesn't try to convert everybody, but he wants to show people and his team who he is. An example of some of the harder issues that he confronted and wrote about very openly to his employees was a school shooting by their headquarters in Texas. And instead of writing about gun control being good or bad, or the Second Amendment being good or bad, his letter to his employee base was how he was hurting as a father, right? As a human and somebody who has grandchildren now, that when he saw stuff like this, he didn't understand why it still happened, and how he was angry that he wanted it to be ending. And he showed that humanity to his employee base. And it really kind of helped build that bond to all of his people, his customers and all of his employees who really kind of were feeling that same sort of pain. At the other extreme, by the way, you'll notice that real quickly, that thing, whose brand is it anyways, at the bottom of the screen. One of the things that his guiding principle, he doesn't think the brand Waste Management is about him or even about the shareholders. It's about the employees. And that's how he thinks about what he's supposed to be doing. The other person I studied on this is Aaron Levy at the other extreme, Silicon Valley, secular leader, young leader. I actually co-taught the Industrialist Dilemma with Aaron for about 5 years. Aaron's really interesting. He's very bright, but he also sometimes will take a non-traditional approach to, for example, the culture of what's going on in Silicon Valley. When there was a lot of, discussion about work-life balance, which, for a variety of reasons is a good thing, his attitude was, look, we're an enterprise software company. And if we get a phone call from a customer at 10:30 at night, we pick up the phone. That's who we are, and that's what we do. And we don't we don't want to create an environment where we're doing that to our employees every Saturday night. But when it happens and there's a crisis, we're there for them. And if employees would come to him and say, well, no, I'm drawing that line, I'm not going to work on a Saturday night if a customer calls, Aaron's attitude was actually very thoughtful and kind. He said, I totally get that, I totally respect that, but that's not who we are. Let me help you find a job somewhere else where you can kind of, it might be a better fit. As he said to me, I'm not going to try to talk somebody into staying. He's very clear about what he's trying to do at Box and who Box is, but he's also very respectful if somebody says, maybe this isn't a good fit for me. And I really love that kind of inclusive nature of standing on one's principles, but also not judging somebody for wanting to do something different. Now, the last leader that I'll mention on this that really, really had a huge impression was Michael Dowling, who runs Northwell Health. Michael came to us in April of 2020, in case that date rings any bells. I was actually in this room right now teaching on Zoom. This was at the height of COVID. Northwell Health, for those of you who don't know, is New York's largest healthcare provider. Michael shows up at 9 o'clock in New York, at 6 o'clock on the West Coast, and he shows up to the class. We didn't think he was going to make it, and so I just started teaching. And so started being my kind of crazy, provocative self. I'm like, oh my God, Northwell Health, this is a horrible business. He's got 3% margins. Like, he's not getting paid, any value for the risk he takes. This business stinks. Like, in the healthcare business, you want to be in the devices business or in the therapeutics business. That's where all the money goes. Northwell Health, this is a terrible business. And I'm provoking the students and everything else. And Michael takes over the class. And he's talking for a few minutes, and he says, I want to go back to something Rob said. He said, I could make a lot more money if I only treated rich people. I could capture a lot more value. But what kind of society would that be? Is that the society we want? How do you value a human life? At the moment that he said that, he had 800 people on ventilators, and he knew that 700 of them were going to die. There were 150 students who, you could feel got goosebumps at that moment. Like, he was being a leader and talking about, he knows his financial responsibility to his shareholders and to his bondholders, et cetera. But he also had a very, very kind of big vision of what the role was of what healthcare plays in society. In my 23 years in teaching at the GSB, it was one of the most magical moments I've ever witnessed in the classroom. And we weren't even in a classroom. We were doing this on Zoom. If you get to that chapter in the book, if you're, if you choose to read it, I kind of walk through all of the ways that Michael deals with all of these cross pressures. And I really think that he's a great leader that we can all emulate. One of the things that, now that I've walked you through this, I want you to be thinking about the following things. I just showed you 11 leaders, and there's more of them in the book. None of them are perfect. They will talk to you about the mistakes they made, the things they get wrong. They're very, very human. They all kind of lead with what I'll call a humble authority. But all of them are successful by any figure of merit. the number of people that report to them, how their companies are doing. I've got other examples in the book of people who are running startups as well. It's not just kind of large organizations. And none of them are the people that we read about all the time, we see on social media or we see in the news. And like, I think great leaders are out there. I think we can actually choose to be exactly the leaders that we want to be. And so some of the final thoughts I want you to think about before we go to Q&A are on this slide. What are the top forces that are impacting your company today? Like what's happening outside of the building that's really kind of creating challenges for your organization? And the second thing is, what are your company's biggest cross pressures? What are the things like of these five that I highlighted? You might even have a different one. What's the biggest challenge where you feel like you're being pulled in 180-degree different directions? Third, how are you spending your time as a business leader? Whether you're managing a team of 3 people or a company of 300, how you spend your time is a signal to everybody else around you as to what you think is important. And so, what's the best way for you to be spending your time in all of this craziness? And finally, what's one thing you would do that you would change about how you're doing your job today that you would want to kind of make that change to make sure that you are being a better leader? Now, I look at all of this and I'm a big believer that how we as leaders act at any moment in time is our choice. I'm a big believer in free will. Robert Sapolsky, one of the faculty members here at Stanford, wrote a book called Determined, A Life Without Free Will. And I actually think that he's wrong. He basically says, we're basically all a biological set of evolution. We react to stimuli from the environment, and that's exactly, we're just synapses firing. In fact, he even said at one point, basically, we fall in love because we like how somebody smells. Now, let's be clear. I've been married to 30 years, for 30 years to the same woman, and I love how my wife smells. But staying married for 30 years and launching 3 children, it's about a whole lot more than that. And I think as leaders, we are exactly the leaders that we choose to want to be. And we have that choice. We can be kind, we can be mean, we can be ambitious, we can be, we can stay inside in our shells. All of those things that we do, we have a choice to be the leaders that we want to be. And I would hope that somebody, if they go through the book, would look at some of these leaders and say, here are some attributes. I could probably emulate some of those things. And I might be able to try some of these things in how I lead my teams. Things that we can do as systems leaders, kind of this checklist, do the hard jobs yourself. All of the leaders that I study don't shy away from the hard jobs. They know they don't just delegate it to their teams. They actually dig in when needed. They're brave enough to say, I don't know, but we'll go get the answer together. We'll go figure it out. They have the trusted few internally and externally inside of their organizations that they listen to get feedback. They're very mindful of where they spend their time. And then finally, they're mindful of the difference between skill and luck. They know at times in their career that they were very lucky. They also know there were times that maybe they had the right job and the right skills at a moment in time to be successful. And that's one of these things, that self-awareness I think that leaders can bring is really, really powerful. In conclusion, what I will say is I think if you put in consistent effort, that everything that I write about in the book is something that we can do. It's not like I think that if you read the book, everything's going to be okay. Do these 5 things and everything will be perfect. That's a listicle article that you read on TechCrunch. I actually believe that the world of leadership today is much more challenging and much harder. And I think that my hope is that with this idea of the systems leadership framework, leaders can kind of look at the challenges they and their companies are confronting and kind of get that confidence of, hey, I can get my team through this. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to get everything right. But actually, I now have a way to kind of deal with all of this craziness that I see in the world. I think it's about as much as commitment as talent, and that you can go from chaos to clarity. All right, I'm looking at the time. I've been talking for about 45 minutes. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to Q&A. So let me pause here. If anybody has a question, you can use the feature on Zoom to put your hand up to ask a question. I see in the chat somebody said something about the quote from Heather McGowan. Heather McGowan is a sociologist. That's learning is the new pension, if anybody's interested in that. Roy put in the chat, wouldn't it be nice if facts were facts? How does one deal with the rise of alternative facts? I think that's a great point, Roy. I think with facts, there's also the understanding of context that leads people to truth. And so, I think that's actually the opportunity for leaders is to help tell that narrative, to help people make sense of what they're seeing in the craziness in the world. Uh, Zoobs, I see you've got your hand up. Hello from London. Are you in Liverpool or are you in London?
I'm in Liverpool. Great to
Okay.
see you, Rob, and thank you for touching upon the memory with Michael Dowling. It definitely was like the top moment of my GSP experience as well. So thank you for sharing that. I have a more personal question. Can you tell us about your experience as an author? I mean, you've written, this is your second book. I know we've known like the multiple hats you wear, and you described all that, but you never spoke about what it's like to be an author. Uh, could you touch upon that?
Um, so it's just so everyone knows, was our TA for the class that year in systems leadership. He's also writing a book now, a memoir. So this is a personal question that I know that he's also living with. What do I say about being an author? The first time I wrote a book, I vowed I was never going to write another one, and then I wrote another book. The whole book publishing industry, like this is the thing, and kind of what it's like. If your last name's Obama, you have one kind of experience. If you're kind of a nobody like me, you have to kind of go through the process of kind of coming up with the book, getting somebody to see if you can get a publisher interested, and then basically you do your own marketing for the book. You don't write a book, you write and sell a book. When I watched Andy Grove write Only the Paranoid Survive, basically he wrote this book. This was, almost 30 years ago. It was really, really good, and people bought it. Like Andy just didn't do much marketing. He was too busy running Intel, but he wrote the book to share. And this romantic notion of, okay, I've learned some things and I want to put it in a book and share that with others, that's not what happens today. And so, like right now, I'm that obnoxious person on LinkedIn who's, posting all the time about the book. And you actually have to do that to actually kind of get it out. For me, it's very uncomfortable. Like I love talking about the content in the book. Like I could do this all the time. I'll quote Jeff Pfeffer. Give me my slides. I can talk for 10 minutes or 10 hours. Just tell me how long you want me to go. This is great. The idea of selling a book, oh, I hate it. I just hate it. But it's part of the process. So there's the kind of the creative part of writing the book, which to me was fun. It's hard, but it's fun. And then there's the second part of it, which is like you have to kind of go on podcasts and you have to go on television and you have to have a digital marketing team. That part no one talks about, and it's also kind of lonely, right? Because your publisher doesn't do that much. I'm having a really good experience with my publisher this time. With Brains and Brawn, my publisher was largely unhelpful. But you'll learn that as you go through it. But I think it's worth doing. I'm glad that I wrote the book, and then to me, the most satisfying thing is when somebody says, "Oh, I read the book and I learned something." Like that, as a teacher, like I love that. Question from the direct message. Seems like some of the things that make a great leader are inherent personality traits, charisma, gravitas. How do you learn those traits? Fake it till you make it. Great question. What's interesting about the leaders that I show? None of them, maybe with the exception of Aaron Levy, or what I would call kind of the showman, or the showwoman, kind of like here's me, like on the camera, kind of waving my hands around and everything else. They're all very, you know, some of them are very reserved in their style, and they're very thoughtful. And so I actually think that we all have our own styles, our own leadership styles. But I think we can also learn how to model some of those good behaviors that we see from others. I'm always going to try to, I'm passionate, Rob, like this energy. For those of you, any of you who are my students or I went to school with, I saw Stu Berman on here. Like I'm kind of like this all the time. And my passion is both my greatest strength and my greatest development need. But sometimes I've got to learn to dial it down and dial it back a bit. And so I think a lot of that is about self-awareness, knowing kind of how we come across and how others will receive it. It sounds very touchy-feely, and those of you will know who know me, I never took touchy-feely. But I think that self-awareness is a good thing. I would say the gravitas of character, I think, comes in who we are and how we were raised and the lessons and mistakes that we've made in our lives and things that we learned when things went well. Um, we all can be the person that we choose to be, and none of us are perfect, and we're all works in progress, and we all make mistakes. But if we can be better tomorrow than we were yesterday, I think that's part of the journey. And all there is the journey. We never get there. I see in the does systems leadership provide a shorthand for leaders to decide when to harvest or explore, or how to invest how much in innovation? That's a great question. I asked a lot of these leaders, how do they balance their time between strategy and execution, innovation? And it was funny, all of them said there's not a hard number. All of them kind of made the comment of sometimes it's an ebb and a flow depending upon what's needed at a moment in time. It was never 100 or 0 at a moment in time, but sometimes it might be 60-40, and sometimes it might be 40-60. It kind of depends on what's needed. Charlie talked about how when he came into Wells Fargo and he had to turn over the management team, he spent a lot of time internally focusing on execution because he had to get the right people in the right places. And once he got them settled, he focused more on strategy stuff. Revathi made a very, very similar point that sometimes when there's a big disruption happening technologically or with a particular customer, she might be focused on that, kind of what was, at a moment in time. But she also knows that there's kind of an ebb and a flow. And I think that's the idea of seeing a system is that you can't get stuck into doing one thing. You have to be able to task switch, but do so not in a hard, abrupt motion, but more in a more fluid motion. And I think that was all the leaders kind of talked about that ability for them to move as needed between one versus another. Andrew wrote, I appreciate the critique of Sapolsky. Hold on, and I missed that one. Let me keep going. How do I respond to a science-based empirical data to support his views? So, like, Robert's a genius. Like, he's totally awesome. But if you go back and keep going back to root cause, he can't, like, he'll say, like, there's a machine, and if you don't want to think there's a machine, that's fine, but there's a machine. But he can't prove there's a machine. Like, ultimately, like, where did the machine come from? And so I would argue that even in what Robert's doing, there's a little bit of faith there in what he's saying. I'm not saying that he's wrong in terms of the science behind it, but I do believe that we can actually make choices and change as to who we are and who we want to be. I wrote a Substack post about this. Like, why would anybody be a teacher if you didn't believe in free will? Like, the whole idea behind teaching is you're trying to give your students or the companies you work with, the tools to be effective to help them be the best versions of themselves. Now, I guess Sapolsky could say that I'm just a stimulus in their world and I'm triggering them, but then why would I do that? Like, I can choose to be a teacher or not. Now, he could say that we can keep going back, to each step and saying that I'm programmed to be that way. I actually just believe that I've seen people change. I've seen people try different things. And I think our ability and desire to do that is something that we can have internally. So ultimately, I'm not saying Robert that his science is wrong, which is like, but ultimately you're going to have to get back to a point of where did it start from? And I tend to come back to the point of where it started from. I'm going to assert free will. And it might as well be that since he can't even prove the nature of the machine. I'm going to assert free will and that we can do the choices as individuals. If nothing else, I think it's a lot more empowering for all of us. Okay, Melissa wrote, how do leaders in the book navigate geopolitics? So this is a good one. National. I think that with stuff like this, number one, you can't ignore politics on a global basis. Like, you're going to have countries that are going to have interests. And by the way, business leaders are now at the center of this. This is a big issue for the GSB and how we train our the next generation of leaders. They're going to have to be fluent in this. Even if you're in a small startup, even if you're just doing startup garage, you're going to be crossing borders. And we better be training the men and women that we're graduating from the GSB to be fluent in understanding these things, not just in regulatory capture, but to be sensitive to what's happening in different parts of the world and the dynamics that are going on there. Let's look at something like the energy transition. You know, 2.9 billion Chinese and Indians get a vote on what energy they're going to use, right? And if they need inexpensive energy, they're actually going to burn more hydrocarbons than clean energy because it's more expensive. And by the way, you can understand why they're trying to bring people out of poverty, raise the standard of living for their civilians and their citizens. So you've got to be thinking about stuff like this as a leader. Like, what does it mean and what's happening? And so how do you navigate through this? I hope you navigate with some curiosity to understand what's happening in other parts of the world, some understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world, and then trying to figure out how do you try to figure out what is your needs in running your organization, but also the people who might be in somewhere else. We have to lead everybody. We don't get to choose who we lead. Like, you have to lead men and women who agree with you and disagree with you, and you have to lead men and women who agree and disagree with you. We've got to lead everybody. And I think that's that duality that I talked about, and understanding that a lot of these issues are hard and being sensitive to that, being aware of that. Okay. Scott. Hi, Scott. Was there a problem challenge systems leaders commonly reference? What do I learn from the different ways these leaders address these issues? I think the biggest one I hear people talk about of the five, and they talked about all of them, the two right now is kind of execution versus innovation, especially because innovation is happening so quickly and how do they commercialize it quickly? Like I skipped the slide on AI, but everyone's trying to figure out, oh my goodness, how do I get AI into what part of what I'm doing inside of a company? That's one. The other one was about purpose, balancing that ambition and stewardship of their organization. That's something I found all of these leaders thought very deeply about. That's something that they spent a lot of time on. Hi, Stephanie. Nice to see you. Thank you for putting your camera on. Do systems leaders inspire, coach other systems leaders in their organizations, or are they unique ambidextrous talent? You know, it's funny. Charles O'Reilly, who taught us ambidextrous with Michael Tushman, this notion of exploit and explore, I would argue that systems leaders, all of the men and women who I studied, they all, I think when they think about stewardship, if I go back to that fifth cross pressure on purpose, all of them were seeing the bigger picture beyond themselves. So I think that they were always looking at developing their people. And again, even Jim Fish, as whose brand is it anyways? Even if it's somebody who's in the factory, how do they feel empowered that it's their company? And to me, that was one of the more inspirational but also aspirational aspects of the men and women that I studied. I really learned a lot from them, and so I really thought that was very very helpful. But I think it kind of does it come naturally. I don't know if it comes naturally or they work at it, but I know they all do it. You know, they all kind of want to look out for others. Okay, I'm just going to keep going through the chat. How does systems think these ideas from Deming and Akoff fit in your work? Yeah, so this is very, very much built on the work of Steve Deming, excuse me, at in the Fifth Sense, which came out in 1995, and the idea of seeing systems that was, and write about that in the book, very, very influential in my thinking, and just trying to build on it in today's world, especially in a world which is even more connected than it was in 1995. I'm grateful to all of you for taking the time and listening to me for a little bit. Best wishes to all of you and hope to see you back on campus sometime soon.